Hello and welcome to the Slav defense introduction video. So what is the Slav defense? Well, this position on the board is the starting point for the Slav defense. So let's go back to the very beginning and see how you would begin this, or how you would come about the point of the Slav defense. So d4, opening move by white, d5, and now we have c4. So this is the queen's gambit, and there are different ways to play against this, which we won't go into in this video, but the Slav defense is this c6 move, which just fortifies the d-pawn, and this is the starting point for the Slav defense. So if we take a look here at the most common moves, it looks like knight to f3 is the top played move, played almost 65,000 times in this database versus 30,000 for knight to c3. So I'll take a look at these different moves and just play them out a little bit here. So starting with knight to f3, the most commonly played move, and it looks like by far knight to f6 is played. Now, if we would play e6, this turns into the triangle system. This could also be considered kind of a semi-Slav, but I won't get into that in this video. In the next video, I'll try and cover the semi-Slav, which, if we go on further here, knight to f3, knight to f6 is played, and this is called the modern line in this database, and it looks like knight to c3 is played most often here by white, and then once again this e6 move pops up. Now this would be the semi-Slav here in this position. So once again you have this triangle of pawns, but you've blocked in the light squared bishop. So the next video I'll cover more of this semi-Slav formation where the bishop is blocked in. But for today, if we keep with the Slav defense instead of the semi-Slav, here we have d takes c4 is the second most commonly played move. So here, this keeps the opening for the bishop here, not blocking it with this e6 pawn. Now the most common move here is normally a4 by 19, almost 20,000 games versus e4, which is the second most played opening variation. All right, so a4 is normally played, and what does this do? It looks like it tries to prevent this b5 move trying to hold on to this pawn. So because this pawn has been captured on c4, white wants to move the e-pawn, unleashing an attack and a possible capture by the bishop here. So if b5 is played, then the c4 pawn will be guarded. But by playing a4, now this pawn can't move to b5, or you would have capture. And then if this pawn recaptures, the knight could capture. So some play in this fashion could occur, but also this gains space on the queen side for white, but there is a downside to this move. A potential weakness here on b4. So that's a possibility. Maybe this bishop moves down here and tries to pin the knight to the king. So continuing on, it looks like bishop to f5 is by far the most played move, because if you're not going to play e6 and block that bishop in, then normally you want to try and bring this bishop outside the pawn chain, because black is at some point going to want to play e6 to be able to get this bishop out. So the bishop on f5 is outside of the pawn chain, helping fight for the center here, preventing this immediate e4 pawn move. So the game continues here, most often with e3, so I'll stick with that for now. E3, and then now we have this e6 move being played most often, and finally the bishop captures here on c4, regaining that pawn, and so now material is even. And then the game might continue. The most often played moves are bishop to b4, then castling to get out of that pin of the knight on the king. Black would go ahead and castle. And then next we have queen to e2. And so this will give you an idea. Both sides are just trying to continue development. So the knight develops here. And then finally we have this e4 move. So the bishop normally drops back here, and then we have bishop to d3. So retreating back, helping guard this e4 pawn in case the bishop captures the knight here. So now, oh, excuse me, it's black's turn. So bishop here pinning the knight. Now, preparing possibly to put some pressure on this pawn. So white takes the opportunity to push forward, chasing the knight. The knight jumps forward. We have knight takes d5, c takes d5. And it kind of almost ends up like a French defense advance, or advanced French variation in the center a little bit. So now, let's see, queen to e3 is normally played. An interesting move. Maybe preparing to jump forward here with the queen, attack the bishop. So bishop to e7, preventing the queen from moving here to g5. Was that the most common move? Yes. All right, so I'll play this out a few moves further. That way you can see how it might progress into the end game. So next we have either knight to g5, moving up here and trying to start an attack. But the most played move is bishop to d2. And then, let's see, knight to b8, maybe preparing to reposition here and attack this pawn. And then knight to e1 to get out of the possible capture by this bishop. And then bishop to g6, f4, knight to c6, g4. So white could just start attacking, and I'll just play a couple more moves here. So f5, capture en passant, bishop recaptures. Now we have bishop to c3, helping protect. Then what? Queen to e8. But you get the picture. I don't want to drag this out too long since it's just an introduction. So let's reset back to the beginning and take a look at this Slav defense from the beginning. So we had d4, d5, c4, attacking this pawn, the queen's gambit, and c6 was the Slav defense. Now, we looked at the most commonly played move, knight to f3. The second most played move is knight to c3 first. And then, let's see here, knight to f6, helping fortify this pawn. And then we have, let's see, e3 being played most often, which, this immediately protects the c pawn. So if it's captured, the bishop can capture. And now e6 would be this triangle formation. But here they still call this the Slav defense instead of the semi-Slav. So as you can see, the Slav and the semi-Slav, they kind of intertwine and go together. So, if you're studying one, you may want to study the other and decide which variations you like best. So now the game would continue with knight to f3, but this transposes into the semi-Slav. So since this is the introduction, I won't get into that here, that the transpositions back and forth between these openings could be important. And something you'd have to be aware of if you dig deeper into this opening. But since this is the introduction, I'll go back. Instead of this move, what else could be played here? It looks like a6 is the second most commonly played move. And then, let's see, knight to f3. And we're in the Slav defense modern chameleon variation. So, this move is pretty flexible. You play a6. It helps fortify a possible future b5 pawn push, perhaps. It also kind of waits, a waiting move to see what white is going to do. So if white plays knight to f3, well then the most often played move is an immediate b5 pawn push. Once again, you could play bishop to f5, getting that bishop outside of the pawn chain. But we could take a look at this. So b5, and then by far 2300 versus 800 and something, the most commonly played move is b3, just fortifying here. And now, instead of bishop to f5, it looks like most often played is this pin on the knight. So then the pin is broken by the bishop. And now we have e6. So the pawn chain is formed here, this little triangle, and the bishop is outside the pawn chain. And now this bishop is also unleashed, so black will be able to castle on the king side. So moving on, we have castling, and then the knight is developed. h3, putting the question to this bishop. And then to keep the bishop pair, normally we have a retreat, bishop to b2, lining up through the middle and aiming at the king side. So bishop to d6, centralizing this bishop, preparing to castle. And then knight to e5 here. So the game continues with capture, knight captures, and then queen to c7 here. So creating a battery, preparing, perhaps to try and capture. So we have 3 attackers on this knight and only 2 defenders. So something has to be done here. First, it looks like most played is capture, capture, then rook to c1, attacking the queen. So the queen just retreats back, keeping pressure on this knight. And so then the knight just captures. So we have capture. And then here, it looks like either the king or the knight can capture. So, what would be best? Let's see. Most often the king captures, and it looks like black has a little more luck with this move, centralizing the king. And now, let's see, f3 to keep the knight from moving forward. queen to b7, preparing to introduce the rooks into the game and fight for this c file. So now we have queen to d3, king over to e7. So, perhaps the queen just wanted to, or the king wanted to get out of the line of the queen in case the center opens up. Maybe protect this pawn. So now we have, let's see, knight to c3 mostly being played, perhaps preparing to attack in the center. And now b4. So the knight is under attack, so the knight just moves, and then perhaps preparing to jump into this outpost. So now we have queen to b5, an interesting choice here. With that move, if we capture, the knight will have to move, and then the rook could go after this pawn. So queen to d2 is played, avoiding the trade, and then now a confrontation on the c file. So it looks like knight to c5 was played, and now you would think maybe you could just trade off here, but that wasn't played in the games. But something to look at. Okay, I'm going to go back because I don't want to dig too deep here and make it too complicated when this is just an introduction. So back to the beginning, we'll take a look at another variation, the d pawn. So d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit, and once again c6, the Slav defense. So we looked at the most common moves are knight to f3 or knight to c3. Usually both of those moves are played. But another option is capturing. So white could just go ahead and capture here, and then we have the Slav defense exchange variation. And now by far we have this capture. You probably wouldn't want to capture with the queen, or the knight would just develop and attack the queen. And the same as if you would check, and then if there's the knight blocking, well then that pawn, well, let's go back here. So if you had this capture, if you tried to check and go after the pawn, well the knight could block, and then maybe keep an eye on this. So most often played after this exchange is just to take with the pawn, and now we have the exchange variation of the Slav. And so next it looks like knight to c3 is played 7,000 times versus bishop to f4 played 2,700 times. So the knight develops, immediately putting pressure on this pawn, blocking any queen checks. And so now we have knight to f6 being played most often, followed up by bishop to f4. And this almost looks like a Jabava London sort of. So we almost have a Jabava London setup with the knight on c3, the pawns on d4 and d5, and a knight on f6 and bishop on f4 here. So normally the game would continue with knight developing here. And then, let's see, e3, protecting the pawn. a6, kind of like in the Jabava, to prevent the knight from jumping up here and trying to target this c7 square with the bishop. Okay, so the game normally continues with bishop to d3, bishop to g4 attacking. And now we have knight at g to e2. And I guess another possibility could have been f3 here, immediately attacking this bishop. But after e6, castle, we have bishop to e7, rook to c1, castle, and now knight to a4. So an interesting move, bringing this knight to the edge of the board. You know, maybe you're preparing to jump in here. So let's see what happens next. Knight to d7, keeping the knight out of here, although the queen was guarding that as well. So I don't know. Let's see here how this continues. So a3, rook to c8, and now b4, gaining space on the queen side. So I'll play out a few more of these moves just so you can get an idea of how the game might progress. So e5, we have a capture here, and knight at d or c captures. Normally, it looked like maybe this is played a little bit more often because that knight was further back here, you know, as compared to this knight, which is a little more active further up the board. So now we have h3, knight takes d3, queen takes, bishop takes. So just a big exchange of pieces here. d4, and now rook at f to d1, rook to e8, and queen up to f3 here. So how would this continue? Bishop to f8, you know, maybe helping fortify against any attacks on the king side here, but also unleashing this rook. So now we have, let's see, knight to c5, and this game went on to a draw after bishop captures, rook captures, queen to f6, bishop over to g3, or excuse me, queen over to g3, lining up on the queen, and then h6, maybe getting ready to try and attack this bishop, which could be trapped. So, or can it? If we go here, you know, maybe this bishop could try and move here and be protected by the queen. So let's see what happens next. King to h2, rook at c to d8, and now b5 attacking the knight. So we have a capture, rook captures, rook to d7, rook to d3, blocking this pawn. And now rook to e4, f3 attacking, rook at e to e7, but you get the idea. This is an example of how the game could go. So let me wrap this video up. We'll go back and see if there's anything else that we should take a look at. I don't want to make this you know, too extremely long for a beginner introduction video. So once again, d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit, c6 is the Slav defense, and we looked at the most common moves, knight to f3 or knight to c3, so developing your knights. C takes d5, so if white captures and you recapture, that's the exchange variation. And then the fourth most played move is e3 here. So this immediately protects the pawn. by playing e3, it does block this bishop, but a lot of times this bishop will stay in here to help guard this b pawn, or move to d2 to break any pins on the knight against the king. So most often played knight to f6, knight to c3, and then e6. Will that turn into the semi-Slav? Possibly after some more moves. Let's see here. Yes, once again. So just remember that often this e6 move will transpose into the semi-Slav. All right, so instead of e6, it looks like once again this a6 move. So instead of going into that, which we took a little look at in the last variation, let's look at g6, another possibility. So g6, perhaps preparing to bring the bishop here and line up on the center and aim at the queen side. And now we have knight to f3. And now this game is transposed into the English opening Caro-Kann defensive system. So, yeah, you just have to beware of the different transpositions that could take place. I'll play this out a little bit further, but I won't go as deep into this since it's kind of going into other openings. Now it says this is a Grunfeld defense. The Buril variation, perhaps, if I pronounce that correctly. But, it would play with this. Castle, bishop to g4. And I'll just play a few more moves so you can get an idea of how the game could progress through the middle game. So, queen to b3. b6, and now h3, putting the question to the bishop. So we have a capture, recapture, e6, bishop develops, knight develops, and now interesting, queen to a4 is played. Perhaps anticipating a knight to a5 move, which would attack the queen, and it looks like the knight usually goes there anyway. But I don't know. If we would attack the knight, it would probably just jump into this nice outpost. So b3 is played to prevent the knight from going there. And now, let's see. a6 is played most often, followed by a knight to e2, knight up to b7, and then queen to c6. Interesting choice there. So instead of, well, the rook can't attack because this knight is under attack. So it looks like the rook to a7 was played here. And then the rook moves, taking control of this open file. Then we have rook to e8, queen up to c7, bishop to f8, and rook over to c6, attacking here. So to relieve the pressure, we have a trade. So something like this. And now, let's see. Rook to b8. Interesting. Knight to f4. And we could play this out a little bit further. So, knight to e8 attacking. The rook retreats. Knight at b. Down here to d6, and rook at a to c1. So there you have it, another example of how the game could play out. So back to the beginning, one more look just in case there's anything else to cover in this introduction to the Slav defense, which is this right here. So we looked at the knight to f3, knight to c3. C takes d5, the exchange variation, and then this e3 move. So after that, I don't know, you run into moves that are a lot less played. Queen to c2. Does anything stand out as being better or worse for one side? Of course, as you go down into these less commonly played opening variations, they're less played because usually they're not as good. We see in the most played moves, it looks like for the Slav defense, black has the best luck when white plays this knight to c3 move first. So we might as well look at the most common move one more time. Knight to f3, knight to f6 is mostly played. Is there anything else that looks good? The immediate e6 would take us, into some semi-Slav territory, perhaps. So, maybe an immediate capture here. And then after e3, well, then we might have this b5 move trying to hold on to this pawn. The computer actually recommends bishop to e, well, not recommends, but the database shows that more often bishop to e6 is played to guard this. So, I don't know, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I guess if the knight jumps up here to attack, well, then the queen could just back that up, and if white takes the bishop pair, the queen would recapture and fortify this pawn. So, I don't know, we could take a quick look at that. Bishop to e6, and then a4 to try and stop a fortification of this pawn. Knight to f6, knight to a3, and so that just puts the pressure on this pawn. So then we have c5, knight takes c4, knight to c6, knight at c to e5, attacking here. So then capture, and here either the knight captures or we have a pin. So capture, queen captures with check, rook captures, and then the bishop recaptures here. So now bishop to d7, breaking this pin, but the knight could capture here. We could have something like this. Either way, a lot of exchanges. And now this could be captured as well. So if we look at this position, we have 5 pawns versus 5. But white is a little more developed and has this pawn majority over here. So it looks like e6 was normally played. Now what? Bishop centralizes to d4, maybe preparing to drop back and protect this pawn and help escort this one forward. So knight to d5, castle, f6, blocking any attacks by this bishop. Rook at f to c1, grabbing the half-open file. And now the king moves forward. That's pretty interesting. I guess heading over here to help guard everything on the queen side. So rook to c4, rook to a8, helping to, or preparing to fight this pawn and try and stop these pawns from marching. rook at A to C1, and now bishop to D6, G3. All right, you get the idea. I have a habit of digging maybe a little bit too deep into these variations. So that was what? D4, D5, C4, C6, and then knight to F3, and then the third most played move to just capture here. D takes C4. But let's see. If the F5 move were played, well then, we could almost transpose back into normal lines. So we have this. Now what? E6. This kind of goes into a Queen's Gambit decline. So just remember, you might, if you dig deeper into this opening, you might have transpositions where you start in one opening and transpose into another one. And you'll just have to be aware of those possibilities, kind of sort them out as you dig deeper into these openings. So here we have queen to B3, queen to B6, C5 attacking the queen. And if the queen captures, it just pulls a pawn to the center and kind of opens up the A file for the rook. So queen to C7 is usually played, avoiding the trade. And now bishop. Bishop to F4. So this is interesting. You attack the queen, enticing it. You don't want to take because then we have a capture and this rook would be trapped. So queen to C8 is played most often. Then knight attacking the bishop. That's ignored. Knight to F6 is played. So then we have capture, capture. So this is another interesting point where these bishops could end up on F4 and F5 for both colors, and then the e-pawn moves forward to protect the bishop. And if the knight captures the bishop and the pawn recaptures, you have doubled pawns, but it really locks down this E4 square for black. Or if white, if it was the reverse and white ended up with a pawn on D4 and a pawn on F4, then he would lock down this E5 square. So now the knight could try and use that, although F3 could chase the knight away. So E3 is normally played, and then we have bishop to E7, bishop to D3, putting pressure on this pawn. And right now it's protected. So castling is played. So now if you try and capture this, and the queen recaptures and the queen white captures here, the knight could just move and this rook would protect the other rook, so it wouldn't be trapped. So H3 was normally played, followed by G6. Now you fortify this pawn, castling, knight at B to D7 to back up the other knight, and perhaps try and start jumping forward in the future. Queen to C2, B6, so some counterplay on the queen side. B4 just fortifies this pawn, and then A5, A3, knight jumps into E4, and we chase that knight. So now we have capture, queen captures, capture, capture. So here you go. This just gives you an idea of how we could progress into the end game. So B takes C5, capture. The knight jumps forward, and rook up to a6. So protected by the bishop, starting to put pressure on this pawn. White has the bishop pair, and it looks like what? 6 pawns versus 6. We're even in material. Now, even though white has the bishop pair, the center's blocked up, so this knight could become valuable at some point if you can find a good spot for this knight. So now, queen up to e6. Protecting this, moving so the bishop, or excuse me, the rook can jump over here and try and fortify. Now, bishop to b5, which this is possible because the pawn is pinned to the queen. So, rook protects, and now we have bishop to a4, knight to h5, and bishop up to d6 here. So capture, capture, queen captures, rook captures, and we're just going way down into the end game here. So now we have what? 5 pawns versus 5. Material is even, but we do have this isolated pawn here, which could come under attack. So the game ended in a draw, and it's starting to look drawish. All right, well, I better end it for there before this video goes on forever. So please leave comments if you would like to. Like and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. And feel free to check out any of these other opening exploration videos, or if there are openings you would like me to go over in the future, just leave a comment with that request. So thank you for watching and have a super chess day.